Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of the struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you for joining me for today's presentation on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We will start with the Civil Rights Act and then speak briefly about the Voting Rights Act and its relevance to today. In a nutshell, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark civil rights and labor law that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Its enactment essentially ended discrimination in public places and in the job hiring process. The end of discrimination in public places is particularly of significance because it ended segregation in places like movie theaters, restaurants, parks, and schools. If you haven't watched our previous videos on the Childrens Crusade of 1963 and our interview with Melvin Todd, I highly suggest you watch them as they will add additional context to this presentation. Events like the Children's Crusade and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom were both vital public demonstrations which took place in 1963 and directly led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Then President John F. Kennedy had been working on creating legislation particular to civil rights since his entry into office in 1961. However, it was the mass public events happening on the ground led by Black activists and groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which really forced him to begin to push for a piece of legislation that would directly address civil rights. The Children's Crusade of 1963, in the month of May, saw thousands of school children march in downtown Birmingham, Alabama. Despite their nonviolent methods, the nation and the world witnessed how police and firemen, led by Bull Connor, met the students with brutality, such as firing water hoses at them and bringing dogs to bite them, in addition to arresting hundreds of students. These images made the issue all the more pressing, and John F. Kennedy met with Black activist leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. several times to discuss what the civil rights legislation should look like. On June 19th, about a month after the end of the Children's Crusade, which concluded, by the way, with the end of segregation in Birmingham, John F. Kennedy sent through Congress his new Civil Rights Act. Just prior to this, on June 11th, the president broadcasted a speech to the nation. The following is an excerpt from that broadcast.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
The bill that John F. Kennedy proposes would do 7 vital things. It would, number 1, safeguard voting, number 2, desegregate public spaces, number 3, enforce the desegregation of schools. And just as a side note, we also have a video on Brown v. Board of Education, the 1954 Supreme Court case decision which had made segregated schools illegal across the country, so make sure to check out that video as well. Number 4, form a community relations service. Number 5, extend the life of the Commission on Civil Rights. Number 6, prohibit federal funds from going to programs that practice discrimination. And number 7, guarantee equal employment. It's interesting what these goals were made, what they were stating, because it goes to show how rights that should have already existed, such as integration of schools, which had been decided in Brown versus Board of Education, literally a decade prior, and the right to vote for all American citizens, which had been guaranteed for women in 1920 through the 19th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment had guaranteed the right to vote for all men regardless of race. So even though these had already existed, and were technically supposed to be happening already, mostly southern states had fiercely opposed both, and therefore the new Civil Rights Act had to address these issues. The road to pushing this legislation through the Senate and the House of Representatives is complex and required a lot of political maneuvering. Though Democrats had a majority in both the House and the Senate, most Democrats were from southern states and therefore represented communities with deeply entrenched beliefs that segregation was legal, or if not even just ordained by God, as some of them claimed. Not surprisingly then, several southern Democrats opposed the bill. I am not politically apt enough to explain the manner by which the legislation was pushed through Congress, but the National Archives, in collaboration with the Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy libraries, have a great site through Google Arts and Culture, which will be linked in the video description, that you can check out if you're interested in learning more about what actually happened within the Senate and within the House of Representatives to get the act passed. They also have a ton of primary sources on there. At the same time that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was moving through Congress, a second event took place which once again brought the eyes of the nation onto the social justice movement for equality and civil rights. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom occurred in D.C. on August 28, 1963, and brought about 250,000 people onto the nation's capital. The march was organized by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, and its most memorable moment was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. The march once again pressured Congress to take action, as the event had demonstrated that the cause of civil rights was shared among people of all races and places of origin. Likewise, the 16th Baptist Church bombings on September 15th, the 16th Street Baptist Church being one of the central places at the marches during the Childrens Crusade, which had occurred months prior. A lot of the students had gathered there before initiating the marches, so it was a very symbolic place, but also a place for the community to rally behind civil rights. The church was bombed and 4 young girls were killed. This event once again brought the issue of civil rights and racist violence to the forefront of the nation. In addition to the difficulties faced by Southern Democrat opposition in Congress, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22nd further threw into question the success of the act. However, just days after Kennedy's death, Lyndon B. Johnson, now president, addressed a joint session of Congress on November 27th, in which he urged Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill, as there was no better moment to do so as the nation mourned, and, quote, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long, end quote. Thus, Lyndon B. Johnson from the onset threw his support behind the bill and would continue Kennedy's consultation of civil rights leaders. Around this time, Representative Howard W. Smith, a Democrat from Virginia, offered an amendment to the bill which would add that discrimination against people be banned not just because of race, creed, color, or national origin, but also based on sex as well. This change was major because it could potentially kill the bill, given that sexism is its own monster, in addition to racism, and adding the issue of discrimination in the workplace against women might be another reason a representative would choose to vote against the bill. However, this amendment was approved, and therefore, when the Civil Rights Act was eventually passed, it would also protect people from being discriminated against because of their gender. This idea had been suggested by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. Alice Paul was an American Quaker, suffragist, feminist, and women's rights activist. She was pivotal in the struggle for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which, as I mentioned prior, prohibits sex discrimination in the right to vote and guaranteed women the right to vote. So a struggle ensues in Congress, with Southern Democrats using a filibuster to stop the bill from passing. But on June 19th, the bill passes the Senate with a 73 to 27 majority. And on July 2nd, the House votes 289 to 126 to accept the Senate's bill. And that same day, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs it. The following clip is a presidential address from that day.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American. My fellow citizens, we have come now to a time of testing. We must not fail. Let us close the springs of racial poison. Let us pray for wise and understanding hearts. Let us lay aside irrelevant differences and make our nation whole. Let us hasten that day when our unmeasured strength and our unbounded spirit will be free to do the great works ordained for this nation by the just and wise God, who is the Father of us all. Thank you and good night.
One year later, Lyndon B. Johnson signs another landmark civil rights bill into law in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This bill was meant to overturn laws and other restrictions on votings at the state and local level, which systematically disenfranchised Black Americans across the country, but mainly the South. Though the 15th Amendment had guaranteed all men's right to vote, regardless of race, and the 19th Amendment had guaranteed it to women as well, after Reconstruction, states across the former Confederacy put in place voter restriction laws and practices that limited the ability of Black Americans to vote. These were things like poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and in general, intimidation to keep Black people from voting in fear of violence. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was especially pushed by the events of March 7, 1965, when peaceful marchers attempted to march 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in what would be called the Selma to Montgomery marches. They intended to speak directly with Alabama's governor, George Wallace, and demand that measures be taken to ensure that Black voters could register to vote. Instead of meeting them, Wallace told state troopers to, quote, use whatever measures are necessary to prevent a march, end quote. Led by the late John Lewis, who was a civil rights activist of only 25 years at the time, the marchers were set upon by state troopers who tear gassed them, whipped them, and beat them as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which some people have recently pushed to be renamed after John Lewis following his passing. This event came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Once again, this event was broadcast across the country and sparked outrage, especially as it did not bode well for the recently signed Civil Rights Act of 1964 that people marching for their right to vote were being brutally met by state troopers. In response to Bloody Sunday, President Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act on March 15, 1965, and it was passed on July 9, 1965, with Johnson signing the act into law on August 6, 1965. This law prohibited states from denying Black Americans the right to register to vote or vote by imposing literacy tests and other measures that predominantly harmed Black American voters. And it also established federal oversight over voter laws, meaning that the federal government's oversight now trumped the state's right to do whatever it wanted to do with its voting laws. Though this was not altogether successful right away, in some places it did have an immediately visible impact, with examples like Mississippi, where voter turnout among Black people increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. However, unfortunately, the story takes a negative turn in our own recent past. On June 25, 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that it was no longer necessary for there to be federal oversight for changes in states' election procedures, even if that state had a history of voter discrimination. This was decided in Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court case, and it basically gutted a key element of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This decision implied that states did not need to be held accountable or have oversight for their electoral processes anymore because no state would pass discriminatory voting restrictions. However, this was obviously not the case. Instead, new voter suppression laws sparked up across the country rapidly. Texas enacted one of the strongest voter ID laws in the country just hours after the Supreme Court's decision. Since that decision, 26 states have enacted new restrictions on voting, and roughly 40% of those states had previously had to clear their voting changes with the federal government, meaning that these new restrictions on voting probably would have been blocked if not for the decision reached by the Supreme Court in Shelby v. Holder. Other examples of new restrictions placed in different states would be cutting early voting hours, restricting the right to vote by mail, and closing polling places in some places. All of these limit accessibility to voting and have been shown to predominantly affect voters of color. Named after the late John Lewis, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 would restore and strengthen parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had been struck down by Shelby. Specifically, it would restore the Voting Rights Act requirement that certain states pre-clear certain changes to their voting laws with the federal government. However, though the bill passed the House of Representatives on August 24, 2021, the bill failed to pass through the Senate. A second attempt also failed very recently, on January 19, 2022, where once again the bill failed to pass through the Senate. Following the tumultuous 2020 elections, even more states have added voter restriction laws, and it does not seem that this will change soon unless the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or one like it, is made into law. This goes to show that the march of civil rights is a push and pull. Often the few steps of progress we make are met with fierce opposition that make it feel like we are taking many steps back. However, if anything can be learned from the story of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it is that the action of ordinary people, especially in a collective, can and does have a massive impact on shaping the future of our country. The valiant efforts of thousands of protesters across the country directly led to both of these landmark bills, and we must continue to believe this is still possible in today's world and in the future. Thank you for joining me in this presentation today. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I have provided a reference list for you to learn more about it in the video description. Additionally, please help us by completing a brief survey also available in the video description. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Once again, thank you for joining us on this educational journey, Black History Matters. We hope to see you at our next presentation.